Hey guys, Mr. Irving again. So now we're going to hit part 3 of our America and World War I chapter. So that's chapter 30 of your textbook. And where we left off yesterday, we just talked about the Great Migration. And today we're going to keep on going with mobilizing the economy and jump into the Food Administration. Now, as y'all remember, food is a weapon. Food is more than just something we use to nourish our bodies. If your enemy can't eat, then they can't fight. If their people start to starve, they'll turn on their government. Food is very, very important during warfare, and no one produced more food than the United States. Now, you can get some taste of this for how food was a weapon by, remember, Great Britain had blockaded the Central Powers. We wanted to sell food to Germany and the other Central Powers, and Britain wouldn't let us. And that initially made us very upset. We almost came to a very bad disagreement with Great Britain over that. But now we're in the war, and we decide we need to start providing food for everyone. Now, if you remember, when the war first started, Germany invaded Belgium. They wanted to go through Belgium on their way towards France. Now, a lot of people felt bad about Belgium, because all of a sudden Belgium now fell under horrible stress. They didn't have much food. Some of their people were starving. So a guy named Herbert Hoover is going to lead this drive to feed the Belgians. People would bring in canned foods, he would load them up on a boat, and then send that boat to Europe, hopefully not being sunk by U-boats on the way, to give food relief to the Belgian people. You can see that picture in the top right-hand corner of the slide that says Belgian relief. Well, this ends up working out very well. It makes Herbert Hoover this hero to the American people. He becomes kind of like a small-time celebrity. So the USA decides we need to have a government organization who's in charge of food production. Their jobs will be things like increase food production, decrease food consumption. Because remember, now that we're in the war, we have to feed everyone in our army, but also the other allied armies. We need to provide food for France, food for Great Britain, food for some of the other over 100 countries that are members of the Allied powers. So it's a big task. So when the Food Administration gets started, they decide who better to lead this new administration than Herbert Hoover. So he's going to become the head of the Food Administration. Now the tactic he's going to use for getting people to buy in to basically eating less is going to be called voluntary compliance. He's not going to use laws to say you can't eat this or you can't eat that. He decides to take a different approach. His job, what he decides to do, is convince the American people that it's in their best interest to eat less. Make them feel like they are part of the war effort. Sure, they might not be in the trenches in France fighting against the Central Powers, but if they eat less wheat or if they don't eat meat on a Monday, they're doing their part. They're making some small contribution to helping the war effort. And if you remember, we had the Minutemen and other people going around convincing the American people that this war was important. So if they buy into that the war is important, and you sell them on they're doing their part by making the small sacrifice, it's helping the war effort, then all of a sudden people are much more committed to doing what they want them to do. So the Food Administration is going to use voluntary compliance. Some examples of this are wheatless Mondays and Wednesdays. So don't eat wheat on either of these 2 days. Therefore, we'll have more for the Army and the other Allied powers. They also had meatless Tuesdays, sweetless Saturdays, which would be my least favorite day. People would also eat things like victory bread. So this would be bread made with a grain other than wheat or with a percentage of less than 100% wheat, maybe 15, 20% wheat, 80% something else. They did all kinds of stuff like this, and people actually complied. Monday would come around, people would forego eating wheat. So it actually worked. They also came up with all kinds of slogans, like if you're eating an apple, be patriotic to the core, eat the whole apple, don't waste anything. One of my favorites was, by all means, save the beans. Solid logo came up with by the Food Administration. So besides this voluntary compliance, he's also going to use propaganda to get a lot of his messages out. Posters, billboards, newspapers, You name the form of propaganda, the Food Administration will use it. You have a couple examples there on your slide. The kitchen is the key to victory, eat less bread. And plant a victory garden, our food is fighting. So the slogan of the Food Administration was, the food will win the war, our food will win the war. Now speaking of victory gardens, before we go on, a victory garden, this is a community garden. So instead of buying everything you need from the grocery store, victory gardens would be the community gardens where people would come together, plant fruits and vegetables, and then harvest those from those gardens so they would have to buy less from the grocery store. If we purchase less from the grocery store, we have more food to send away to the army, if the grocery store even had enough to send something back. So the whole idea, again, we're calling it a victory garden instead of just a community garden. People buy in. You're doing your part by helping with these victory gardens. And about 5 million of these sprung up in the United States during this time. They would pop up in backyards, vacant lots, schools, everywhere. Everywhere you could plant something, someone was in their own little victory garden. So the Food Administration, it actually is going to be very effective. So let's look at the results. Food or farm production going to increase 25%. Food consumption is going to drop 15%. Food exports to the Allies tripled. In fact, we sent about a fourth or a quarter of everything we make in the United States is going to be sent abroad. So we're going to send a ton of food to our allies. But they're going to be so effective with the Food Administration in terms of producing more and consuming less. Their tactics are going to be copied. This whole idea of voluntary compliance, selling the people on they're doing their part, is going to be copied by other government administrations. One good example of that is the Fuel Administration. Fuel Administration gets started just about the same day as the Food Administration, and they're going to have the same goal. Let's use less fuel, produce more. So they'll have things like gasless Sundays, heatless Mondays, lightness or lightless nights. Don't turn on your lights at night. Save that energy so we can use that for the war effort. And that, again, is going to be very effective. People respond to feeling like they're part of something. So, now that we're in the war, let's talk a bit about paying for the war. Now, as you know, war is expensive, and World War I is no exception to that. World War I is the biggest war we've ever had so far. It's going to be extremely expensive. Now, the bill at the time for the USA in the war was about $32 billion. That's in their dollars and not 2015 dollars. But eventually, if you were going to add on the interests and veteran benefits paid out over the life of those soldiers, really the bill for World War I is about $112 billion. So it's a hugely expensive endeavor. But let's deal with this $32 billion to start with. How are we going to pay $32 billion? We don't really have credit cards yet, so we can't put it on the credit card. The first answer, the main way, is going to be bond drives. There's these things called Liberty bonds. So government bonds have been around for a while, where you basically loan the government money, and they will pay you back that money with a certain amount of interest on a set date, usually a year, 5 years, 10 years, something like that. Well, let's use the same tactic we've used in the past. Convince people what they're doing is helping the war effort. Instead of bonds, let's call them Liberty bonds. By loaning the government money, the government will pay you back later, plus you're doing your little effort to help the war effort. So these bond drives of selling Liberty bonds are going to be extremely effective. They're going to sell $21 billion worth of Liberty bonds. So this poster, propaganda poster on your slide is a good example. Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. So basically, your dollars are helping fight the Germans. But 21 billion, we're only about 2/3 of the way towards where we need to get. How are we going to raise that final third of the cost of World War I? Well, luckily, we have that handy 16th Amendment that passed right before the war began. That was the income tax. We are going to raise our rates on the income tax, basically taxing the wealthier more to help pay for the war. And that's how we're going to raise the rest of the cost. So the top tax rate, if you're curious, during World War I was over 70%. So if you're making a ton of money, that very top amount of that money is going to be taxed. 70 cents for every dollar will go towards the war effort. So if you think taxes are bad now, you have no idea how bad things were back in the day. Okay, next thing we're going to look at is some other government reforms. Now, all of these reforms are going to have links to World War I that happened in this time period. 18th Amendment is first. Now, as y'all remember, we've talked about the 18th Amendment before. This is prohibition. 18th Amendment takes alcohol away. You're no longer allowed to sell alcohol in the United States. However, the 18th Amendment actually got its start. Its father, if you would, was actually passed during World War I, Prohibition Act. So the Wartime Prohibition Act was a law that went into effect that basically banned the sale of alcohol for anything over 2.5% of alcohol. Basically, beer, wine, whiskey, any of your liquors, all of that is out. You can no longer sell that to the American people. You might think, why would the government ban liquor during World War I? Well, the most popular form of liquor at the time was beer. A very important ingredient in beer is wheat. The less wheat we use to make beer, the more wheat we can use on the war effort. So it was all about saving our resources, saving our food, using it for more productive things than alcohol. So then, once the war becomes over, you got to start to think, well, if beer is still the most popular, why did we all of a sudden decide to ban liquor after the war was over? A lot of the biggest breweries in the United States, so the beer makers, were Germans. So your Budweisers, your Anheuser-Busch, your Schlitz, your Pabst, all of those are German names. So the anti-German hysteria created during World War I is going to continue, and people are saying, good, let's help them go out of business, outlaw their product. So that's going to feed into how we passed the 18th Amendment in 1919. Another government reform is going to happen right about this time is daylight savings time. So we just came out of daylight savings time now. Daylight savings time is actually created by this guy in New Zealand, but the very first country to do it was Germany during the war. The whole idea, let's set our clocks forward or backward in a way to save energy, so we have more hours of daylight. The whole thought being, the more hours of daylight you have, the less hours of darkness, meaning the less hours you have to use energy or fuel during those hours. So you'll save more resources for the war effort. That's going to catch on after Germany does it to other Western European countries, and eventually the United States will do the same. So there's a fun propaganda ad there on the bottom right hand corner. Victory! Congress passes daylight savings bill. Get your hoe ready. There's more hours of daylight. You can do more work at the farm, produce more food, produce more goods. Also, the 19th Amendment, as you remember, is going to let women vote for the first time in federal elections, guaranteeing women to vote everywhere. Certain women could vote already in certain states. This also has its roots in World War I. After World War I, Wilson is going to just be not attacked, but heavily pressured by women's groups. Women play a huge role in World War I, and they're going to protest after this war is over. It's time for us to finally get the right to vote. We've served so well during the time period. What else could you ask from us before you give us the right to vote? So Wilson will help champion the 19th Amendment as it's going through the Senate, and it will be passed, allowing women to finally vote in the United States. Okay, so now we've finished 2 of our 3 mobilizations. We talked about mobilizing the people, and we talked about mobilizing the economy. Now we've got to jump down to mobilizing the army. Arguably the most important of those 3 for fighting the war. Now most people didn't think we'd actually be in the war very long. We thought we'd hop in, and people would see us and freak out and surrender, and that was dumb. It quickly becomes very apparent that America was going to be in this war for a while, till the war ended. And because of that, we need more soldiers. When America enters the war, we only have about 100,000 soldiers in our army. Some of these big powers that have been fighting had well into the millions, as up as 4.5 million men in their army. So America did not have much of a chance the way it was. Now, initially, Wilson's going to ask for volunteers, saying, come on down, serve your country. You see that very famous propaganda ad of, I want you for the U.S. Army, so go down to your local recruiting station and sign up. Unfortunately, not enough men are going to volunteer. Now, by certain standards, you could argue World War I is one of our least popular wars. Not enough people volunteered, so therefore we're going to have a draft. So that's going to become the Selective Service Act. It's going to be passed in May of 1917. And the majority of the soldiers who were drafted into World War I, both white and African American, were drafted. So of the 4 million soldiers we have, about 2.5 million are drafted. The rest are volunteers. So a lot of volunteers are going to be needed. Now, if you remember, this is not the first draft we've had in American history. We've talked previously about the Civil War and the drafts in that war. And if you remember, some of the Civil War drafts led to all kinds of problems. There were draft riots that broke out in lots of different cities in the country. Very famously in New York, had a very bad draft riot. And one of the main problems with the draft back then is you could buy your way out. So if you had $300 or could provide a substitute, then you were excused. You could go on and do something else. A lot of people thought that wasn't fair. That makes this, the poor have to go fight the war, the rich man's war, but the poor man's fight. So when the government was implementing this draft with the Selective Service Act, there's no longer any way to get out through money. You can't buy your way out. You can't provide a substitute. If you're drafted and if you are eligible, meaning you didn't have a lot of dependents, let's say you're single, you don't have kids, and you don't work in a job that's really important to the war effort. So if you're not working on a farm or if you're not working in a factory making war goods, there's a great chance that you are going to be drafted. Now, initially, those draft ages were all males between the ages of 21 and 30 had to register for the draft. Eventually, that's going to be expanded to all males between the ages of 18 and 45. Now, not all males are going to be drafted, but several will be. Now, as we said, African Americans also drafted into this war, but back then, the Army is still segregated. So about 300,000 African Americans will serve in the Army, but all in segregated units, and usually doing not the best jobs. Digging ditches, doing food work, cleaning up, things like that. But we'll come back to their experience later on. Now, not everyone was jazzed about going to this war. Remember, this war was not popular with everyone. A lot of people have major problems with going to this war. So several people will avoid the draft, what we'd call a draft dodger. Now, the numbers of this are hard to hammer down, but most historians put it at between 200,000 and about 350,000. So somewhere in there, that many people just either ignored their draft notice or claimed they were a conscientious objector, so someone whose beliefs are incompatible with war, so they can't go and fight in the war, whether they be Quakers or pacifists, etc. But a lot of people just didn't want to go to the war. Some of those draft dodgers will be prosecuted, about 10,000 are, but most of them will get away with it. Okay, so now we got the Army ready. We've constructed this big army, about 4 million men. Let's talk about how we're going to use it in the war. Now, America gets into the war really late. We jump in 1917-ish. We're only going to get into 2 major battles. We'll see other combat for sure, but 2 big battles. So we've avoided most of the destruction. We haven't been there for the worst parts of the war. By the end of the war, the United States has suffered about 100,000 soldiers have died, which is a terrible number and a ton. 48,000 of those soldiers died in battle, about another 60,000 died of disease, so more died of disease than battle. That is a pattern we'll see in most of our wars we study. And on top of that, on top of the 100,000 killed, we have almost 250,000 wounded. Now that is a horrible amount of casualties, but compared to the other countries, in terms of just soldiers, about 10 million soldiers will be killed in World War I total. So 100,000 compared to 10 million is not a huge percentage. So America got out relatively light since we got into the war so late. So we will come out of the war much better in terms of our male population that has not been killed. Now, some people would point to us getting in the war late and only being in a couple big battles to say, well, the U.S. didn't really have a big contribution in World War I. We weren't really that important. That would not be true. The United States is extremely important in World War I, and especially important to ending the war. One of the big reasons the war ends when it does is now America has joined those Allied powers. That's going to tip the balance of power between the Allied powers and the Central powers. Now we have this new huge nation with tons of resources and a huge army that can potentially extend this war for years and years and years. And because of that, that's one of the reasons Central powers decide to surrender when they do, stop fighting when they do. So America is very influential in ending World War I. So let's talk about the end of the war. Now, one important speech to talk about is the 14 points. Now, Woodrow Wilson is going to give this address back in January of 1918, so still plenty of war left when he gives this speech. But in this speech, he's trying to lay out what he wants the world to look like after the war. We need to have a peace treaty based on these 14 points that will make sure we don't have any wars again in the future, to make sure this great war will be the war to end all wars. Very idealistic, but that's what he wants to see happen. So each of these 14 points will address those 4 underlying causes of the war that we talked about before. Now, all of these are going to be important to Woodrow Wilson, but the one most important to him is going to be the League of Nations, this last point. We're going to talk more about the League of Nations soon. So, 14 points is delivered. We actually spread this around the world. It's not only read in the United States, but it's read in Europe by the Central powers and Allied powers alike. And the Germans, while reading this with the Central powers, see the 14 points and say, this doesn't sound that bad. This is a more conciliatory peace, not a punishing peace. It's calling for everyone to take kind of steps back in terms of imperialism and the size of armies. Germany thinks, if we end the war on these terms, that's not so bad. We could live with that because it's not going to punish them severely. So one reason why the Germans surrender when they do, besides the United States now being mobilized and ready for war, is they assume the war treaty will be drawn up based on these 14 points. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, so November 11th, Germany and the Central powers will surrender. That is Armistice Day. Now in the U.S., you'll realize we celebrate Veterans Day on that day, that Wednesday. But for most of the world, they call that day Armistice Day still. It's still a major holiday. So the war has now finally come to an end. And as we said before, 10 million soldiers are killed total, 20 million civilians. So this is the deadliest conflict in world history so far. Truly devastating, terrible war. But now the war's over. We got to come up with a peace treaty. An armistice can't last forever. We have to have a formal treaty ending the war. So everyone's going to meet in Paris. So a lot of peace treaties get drawn up in Paris. It's convenient for everyone. It's kind of central. We've got plenty of hotels. Paris makes sense. It's the place to go for signing these treaties. Now, there's tons of countries represented at these Paris peace talks, but only 4 really matter. 4 hold all the power. Now, Woodrow Wilson will go. You can recognize him on the right side of that picture. He's going to represent the United States. He doesn't trust his Secretary of State or some senators or a different delegation to go. He thinks it's so important that he must go himself and negotiate this treaty. So Wilson will leave for months to negotiate these Paris peace talks. From the next up on your right is going to be George Clemenceau from France, and a great mustache, George Clemenceau. Next up on the left is Orlando from Italy. He's actually going to leave about halfway through. Italy did not get what they want out of this treaty. They're going to be largely ignored, Italy doesn't play a huge role in World War One. Plus, he's going to have domestic issues that Orlando will have to go home to deal with. So the big four is going to quickly become just the big three. And the last member of that big three is going to be David Lloyd George of Great Britain, there on the far left. Now you might notice, of those big four, there's some key members you would think are missing for this peace treaty, namely Germany. If we're making the peace treaty with Germany, wouldn't you think they would be there to represent their interests and their thoughts? But they were not invited to Paris for these peace talks. Neither was Russia, so Russia is kept out. Russia is now basically the USSR, it's no longer Russia. That's kind of scary, so we don't invite Russia either. So these three men, largely, are going to basically lock themselves in a room and redraw what the world will look like post-war. Wilson comes in with the goal of, let's not make this treaty too punitive. Let's make it a more conciliatory peace. If we punish Germany too harshly, they're going to get mad and want revenge, and then the cycle of violence is going to keep going. After this war, we'll just end up with another war, kind of like we did with the Franco-Prussian War leading to World War I. So Wilson wants a conciliatory peace, not a punitive peace. Unfortunately, there's going to be some challenges to Wilson's idealism. Europe has been devastated by World War I. France, Great Britain, they've lost millions of men. They want revenge. They want to make sure Germany can't get strong and do this again. They can't reindustrialize. So Wilson's going to come up to bat with some very strong opinions on wanting to punish Germany instead of being lenient on Germany. So Wilson is going to compromise a lot of his beliefs. He wanted all the 14 points to be in that final treaty. He won't get them. Only 4 points total will be in the end. He gets to keep the most important one to him with the League of Nations, but he will negotiate away and compromise on the others. So the final treaty, the treaty dealing with Germany, is called the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles will have over 400 sections in it. It has about 440. The first 26 deal with creating the League of Nations, what Wilson wanted so badly. But the rest of them, over 400, will be dealing with punishing Germany. The first of those was, or not first, but one of the most important of those is going to be the War Guilt Clause, also known as Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, what the War Guilt Clause says is Germany has to accept guilt for starting World War I. They are responsible. It's not those 4 underlying causes we spoke about. It's not nationalism, militarism, imperialism, or alliances. It's Germany. And by them signing off on that, it makes them, or it can force them to pay reparations. Reparations being payments to make up for a wrong they've done. Now, at the time that Germany signs this treaty, and Germany is forced to sign this treaty, they have no choice. It's like, sign it or we turn the guns back on and destroy your country. They didn't know what the reparations were going to be. Later on, a team will get together and hash it out, and it will be an astronomical sum of money. More money than Germany could pay. In fact, it was about $420 billion in today's money. So an absurd amount of money that they couldn't pay off. In fact, it would have taken them until the 1980s to pay it off if we actually put it in. So Germany has to sign this War Guilt Clause. They're going to have to pay these huge amount of reparations. They're not going to pay them all. We'll talk about that soon in the next chapter. They're also going to be severely limited in terms of the size of their army. Can't have a large army. They're going to lose territory. They're going to lose all of their navy, all of their air force, all of their artillery. They're going to be very, very restricted. So we're going to punish Germany very harshly. So the majority of the Treaty of Versailles punishes Germany. But, at least to Wilson, the most important thing did get accomplished. The League of Nations is created. So it will compromise away everything else just to make sure that comes through. Now, at the height, the League of Nations is going to have about 56 members, but arguably the most important member is not going to join. We'll talk about that in a second. So the League of Nations, It's going to be a world parliament to prevent all future war. It has one job. This is going to be the place where all these countries will come together, they'll talk about their issues, and they won't fight each other anymore, because now they'll have a place to get together and talk. But just talking is all well and good, but how are you really going to prevent all future wars? Well, this is where Article 10 of the League Charter of the League of Nations come in. Article 10 says that if any member of the League is attacked, is basically invaded, has their territory threatened, then every other member of the League is bound by this treaty to come to their aid. So, if any member of the League of Nations is attacked, everyone else has to go defend them with their military. The idea being, who would want to fight every other nation? That's crazy. They'd surely lose. This way will prevent all future wars. It kind of makes sense in a way, but it's not going to work out so well. The League of Nations is going to last from 1919 to about 1946 when we decide, well, that didn't work out so well. So we'll come back to that soon. One big reason the League of Nations is not very effective is it's going to be missing some key members, even though it has 56 people in it. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson has finished the Treaty of Versailles, him and the other big three. But if you remember, the U.S. Constitution is kind of unique. The president doesn't have absolute power to just negotiate treaties and sign them and we're done. Wilson, because of the Constitution, he has to share that power with the Senate. The Senate is supposed to advise and consent and ratify treaties. Now, certainly Wilson didn't care about the Senate advising on this treaty, but they have to ratify. And what's going to make this even harder, in 1918, the election of 1918, the Republicans are going to take control of the Senate for the first time during Wilson's administration. Remember, Wilson was a Democrat. So Wilson's going to come home with this treaty, and he needs 2/3 of the senators to vote for it to come into law. Now, a lot of senators are going to have a problem with this. A lot of Americans have a problem with this treaty. It's going to be attacked from the left for being too harsh on Germany. It's going to be attacked from the right on being not harsh enough. Some people attack it for being too pro the British. Everyone's going to have a problem with this treaty in some way. So Wilson's going to have a very tough job trying to sell this treaty to the people. Now, a large chunk of the senators and the Americans at this point are really becoming more isolationists. We've gotten involved in this war. We lost about 100,000 soldiers. And what do we have to show for it? Not a lot. Some people start to say this war was a mistake. What did we get? So they want to turn internal. Focus on what's just going on in America. Take a step back from world affairs. One of the leaders of this group is going to be a senator named Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge and Wilson hated each other, couldn't stand each other. And Henry Cabot Lodge is going to take on a leadership role in the Senate of basically saying, I don't like this treaty the way it's written. We should at least be able to change it, make amendments to it if we're going to vote for it. And he's going to be behind another group called the Irreconcilable Senators. These are senators who are even more extreme than Henry Cabot Lodge, but they are basically saying, no way, we hate this treaty. They are strong isolationists. Their nickname for the Irreconcilable Senators was the Battalion of Death. So they are very intensely against this treaty. So Wilson, he's having a harsh time with the Senate getting the support he needs, so he decides, I'm going to go out on tour. I'm going to bring my message straight to the American people. I'll hop on a train, go city to city, and tell the people why this treaty is good and why the American people should ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. And the American people will listen to me. They'll call their senators and demand they vote for the treaty. Maybe this was a bit of arrogance on Wilson's part, or maybe just a political miscalculation. Now he's going to go out on tour. The senators, the irreconcilable senators, will actually follow him as he goes. So every stop Wilson makes, the irreconcilable senators will be right behind him. And they will deliver their own speech when Wilson gets done talking about why they shouldn't ratify the treaty and why this treaty is bad for America. So that's going to be bad news. Add on top of that Wilson was kind of sick. He's not in the best health before this tour begins. His doctors and his people close to him advise him, I don't know, Woodrow, maybe you should not go out on this tour. He's like, nope, I'm going to go. And he should have listened. He is going to collapse in Colorado while giving a speech. He will then have a stroke, which will end up paralyzing half his body for months and months. Wilson doesn't actually meet with his administration, his team, for almost a year. For about 8 months, he's completely incapacitated. Now, that whole time, the status of his health is not revealed to the American public. They just think everything's fine. He's hanging out and doing meetings. But really, he was completely out of it. And his wife was kind of running the country. So, what's going to happen to this treaty? Everyone's been talking. The president says we got to ratify. A lot of senators say we don't want to ratify. Well, Henry Cabot Lodge is going to make some amendments. He's going to make 14 amendments to the Treaty of Versailles. Now, he picks number 14 just to one more jab at Wilson. Him and Wilson don't get along. 14 amendments, and these are amendments that try to reduce America's involvement. So if one of the League of Nations members is attacked by somebody else, we wouldn't automatically have to go and send our troops abroad to Europe. Some of these irreconcilable senators thought this treaty took away from our sovereignty, that all of a sudden we lose the ability to declare war. War can be declared by Europe, and we have no say in it. So that makes a lot of members of Congress uncomfortable. But Lodge makes 14 amendments. Now, if Wilson was willing to compromise, he might say, oh, well, I still have the treaty. Sure, I have these amendments to them, but then I still at least get the treaty. Wilson was not great at compromise. Remember, he's kind of arrogant. His way or the highway. Europe would have loved still for America to pass this treaty with amendments or not. They just want us to be involved in the League. But Lodge proposes these 14 amendments. All of a sudden it's about to come for a vote. And Wilson is going to decide, no way. I hate this new treaty with these amendments. He's going to tell everyone loyal to him, the Democrats who are left in the Senate, do not vote to pass this treaty or ratify this treaty. Wilson is going to tank his own treaty. And because of that, enough senators listen to him, they will not get the 2/3 vote they need to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. They'll try again. Again, it'll fail. So Wilson refuses to compromise, so therefore the Treaty of Versailles is never ratified by the United States. We actually draw up a separate treaty with Germany later on. Now, because we don't ratify the treaty, that means the United States never joins the League of Nations. Remember, we come out of the war being kind of the top dog, the top military and economic power. We're the biggest kid in the class, and we aren't involved in the League of Nations. So if that happens, it's going to make the League substantially weaker than it would have been, especially since we're the ones who proposed the League and drew it all up. Here's a good political cartoon dealing with this issue. We have a bridge that represents the League of Nations, designed by the United States. It's got Belgium, it's got France, it's got all these important bricks, but it's missing the keystone, the most important brick, and that is the brick of the United States, because we never ratify the treaty. So this bridge, or A&E bridge, missing a giant segment, not really a bridge. It's really ineffective. You can't drive your car over it, you can't walk over it, because you just fall into the hole and die. So, let's talk about the political results of the war. One, as we said, the U.S. is the big winner. We become the world economic and political power. We are in great shape because we weren't affected by the war, at least in terms of proximity. The war happens in Europe, so the war doesn't tear up our landscape. Also, Russia is going to fall to communism. We thought for a second after the first Russian Revolution in 1917 they're going to turn democratic. The Tsar abdicated, but it's not going to work out. The Bolsheviks will take over, and Russia will turn communist. We're going to talk a lot about that soon. Also, all the other major powers are going to fall into decline. Britain, France, Austria, Turkey, all go into decline. The Ottoman Empire is taken apart. the Austro-Hungarian Empire taken apart. Britain and France make out well in the Treaty of Versailles, but they've spent so many resources and lost so many men that they are still in a state of decline, in a state of less power than they had before the war broke out. But maybe the most important political result of the war, Germany. Germany was totally devastated by the Treaty of Versailles. As you can imagine, the country's going to fall into chaos. They can't make these reparation payments. No one trusts the government. They lose faith in the government. They start to look for other options. Because if this government, the best they can do is give us the Treaty of Versailles, why do we have them anyway? Different groups of radical factions will start fighting for it between maybe some communist forces. This new fascism that's sweeping Europe also is going to come in. And eventually, a young Adolf Hitler will come to power. So some people argue very much that without the USA refusing to join the League of Nations, turning inward, we have to share some of the blame for the rise of Hitler. If we could have done a better job keeping the Treaty of Versailles from being so punitive, or taking a greater role in world affairs post-World War I, maybe we could have kept Hitler from coming to power. But we'll address some of these questions later on. Last thing for us to talk about today, the election of 1920. So back in the country, Woodrow Wilson decides this next election, the election of 1920, is going to be a referendum on the League of Nations. If the people vote for the Democrats, that means they are for the League. If they don't, then we'll be isolationist. The Republicans are going to nominate a guy named Warren G. Harding, who had just fantastic eyebrows. He was considered one of our most attractive presidents. He had a child out of wedlock. We'll talk more about him soon. He never really came out strongly against the League of Nations, but his platform was, let's return to normalcy. Let's get back to focusing on America. We had this whole European adventure, and that was something, but let's get back to normal. And that's going to be very appealing to a lot of people. The Democrats are going to nominate a guy named James Cox, who's also going to have a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt as his running mate, as his VP on the ticket. He is going to basically represent an extension of Wilson's politics. James Cox was a big believer in the League of Nations, a big believer in the Treaty of Versailles, thought we should be in the League of Nations. He's much more of an internationalist instead of an isolationist. Well, this election is framed as isolationism versus internationalism. The people vote, and Warren G. Harding will win pretty comfortably. So the message that some political scientists and historians take out of this election is people were tired of internationalism. They wanted to turn inward, focus on isolationism, focus on the country for a while. We're not going to be the only country. After World War I, Britain is going to turn very much isolationist. France does the same thing. Everyone's going to want to start to take a blind eye towards what's happening in the other countries. And unfortunately, we're going to talk about what that leads to soon. So, hopefully that helped. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see y'all later.